This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
It's both kind and rational to like knowing animals. I can't deny it's fashionable to like knowing animals.
Hello everyone and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. My name's Josh Milburn and I do like knowing animals. This episode is brought to you by the Animal Politics book series from Sydney University Press. And actually today we're talking about a book from the Animal Politics book series. So I'll jump straight in to introducing today's returning guest, someone who first appeared on Knowing Animals back in 2018. Professor Claire Parkinson is a Professor of Culture, Communication and Screen Studies at Edge Hill University here in the UK. She's also the co-director of the university's Centre for Human Animal Studies, which she established in 2014. Her books include 2011's Popular Media and Animals and 2020's Animals, Anthropomorphism and Mediated Encounters. Today, however, we're going to talk about her 2024 Sydney University Press collection, Animal Activism on and Off Screen, which she co-edited with Lara Herring. And in particular, we're going to look at her chapter, Anti-capitalism, Animal Rights and Advocacy in Okja. Welcome to the podcast, Claire.
Hi Josh, thanks for having me.
Can you tell us the story of how this edited collection came together?
Well, it was at the point where Joaquin Phoenix made his now very famous speech at the 2020 Academy Awards and spoke about his advocacy, and he promoted veganism, and the whole speech caused shockwaves. I think certainly the popular press picked it up and there was mixed reactions to it. I think in advocacy groups and the movement, there was cheers and people were absolutely delighted that he'd used this platform to make the points that he had. And it was absolutely a pro-vegan, we might say a pro-vegan, because he talked about issues around dairy. So it was very much a pro-vegan sentiment in the speech. And I was chatting with Lara, who's the co-editor of the book we're talking about today. And we were talking about, like many people, we were talking about this speech and we were really fascinated by it. And we actually ended up writing together a journal article specifically about Joaquin Phoenix's speech. And we were thinking about how this marked a really interesting turning point or a change in the ways in which people were using their celebrity, but also using the Oscars and Academy Awards and other awards speech opportunities to talk about various different kinds of issues. And we were particularly interested in the pro-vegan sort of discourses and the animal rights messages that people were promoting. And so this got us to thinking about the sort of environment that these statements are being made in. And so we felt that there was a sea change, and we kind of traced it back to the early 2000s. And we were thinking about how things have changed in terms of the ways in which people can access now what we might think of broadly as animal rights films or animal advocacy films in ways that they couldn't do before. And that's been facilitated now by different kinds of streaming platforms, for example, particularly Netflix. And so we were sort of thinking about as this is a really interesting shift. There's a really interesting change that has gone on there. So we were going through this conversation and talking about it, and we said, has anybody done a book about this? Is anybody talking about this more broadly? And so we came up with the idea of a book that would look at animal activism on and off screen, and that ends up being the title of this particular book. And so we really wanted to focus on the different aspects in this where we saw it as a particular change or set of changes that have happened, and they're changes both culturally and socially and technologically that have brought us to this point, and actually for us brought us to this point in 2020 where we were listening to Joaquin Phoenix's speech at the Oscars. So we wanted to do something. We wanted to bring together a number of scholars who are all working across these different areas, and we asked them to think about this point, this change. And we wanted to structure the book in a very particular way. So when you look at it, you'll see that we start off with a section which is essays on representations of animal activism. And then it moves on to actual activists, what we might think of as activist films and television, and how audiences have received them. And then the third section then deals with celebrity activism. So this is the whole idea of the on and off screen aspect of it. We wanted to look at the three different dimensions.
You mentioned this idea of the animal rights film or the activist film, and lots of listeners will be familiar with factual media that's in that space. So Earthlings, another Joaquin Phoenix connected film, or Blackfish, or Ghosts in the Machine, or one of my personal favourites, the BAFTA-winning 73 Cows. But one of the things that you're keen to do in the book is frame lots of works of fiction as advocacy films. You also mentioned this idea of advocacy fiction.
This was one of the things that we were fascinated by, which was that when you talk to people about animal activist films, the first thing that people think of is documentaries or factual productions. And so we wanted to think about as well the fictional aspect. And we were interested both in terms of how animal activism is represented in fictions, but then also the idea of what I call advocacy fiction, which are those films that maybe have commercial appeal and reach wide audiences, but also have an advocacy message attached to them. But that advocacy message is very much, it's fiction. It's a fictionalized film rather than what we might think of as the kind of hard-hitting documentary or factual approaches. And the reason that actually Lara and I in the book, we both focus on fiction films. Most of the chapters are actually about documentary, but in each of the sections we have something which is either on fiction television or fiction film. And the reason for that was because we wanted to kind of redress the balance, but we also wanted to think about what the impact of those kinds of films might be. And one of the reasons is that you're probably aware that a lot of the what are classed now as social issue films, broadly social issue films, ones that tackle sort of a difficult topic, documentary films particularly, they often have an impact campaign attached to them. So once you've watched the documentary, you Google it, you go online, it'll have a website or it'll have, social media presence, and there'll be usually a set of actions that you can follow. What do you want to do next? This is something that you can do if you've been interested in the themes in the film. You can do this or that, and it'll give you a set of different things that you can do. And fiction films don't necessarily do that because they're there as commercial vehicles and they're not necessarily interested in having impact campaigns attached to them. And a lot of documentary films have the impact campaigns attached to them because they're funded. And if the filmmakers can then show later on, look, this is the impact that the film has had, obviously that is great in terms of justifying the funding for the film in the first place. But commercial filmmaking and fiction film is slightly different. It doesn't necessarily have those same pressures and different budgets as well often. So we were really interested in what a fiction film can do and what the documentary and the factual films can do as well. So we tried to get a balance between the two. But in each of the sections, we wanted to focus on something that was around fictional narratives and ask those same questions. What can those films do? And is there anything that we can take from them that can be recognisably part of a toolkit that animal advocates can use more broadly? So we were thinking as well in terms of trying to identify tools or maybe narrative techniques that capture audiences' imaginations and perhaps audiences can identify with, and then saying, these might be things that could be useful in advocacy campaigns more broadly.
Yeah, good. So let's dig into your chapter a little bit, which is about Okja. So for listeners who might be unfamiliar with the film, could you give us a quick introduction to it?
Yes, so Okja is a film directed by Bong Joon-ho. It was a Netflix original film. It was premiered at Cannes in May 2017, and then there was a Netflix release in June the same year. And it's the story of a genetically modified pig called Okja. And Okja is created by a corporation, and the corporation send these modified pigs, these super pigs, to live with various different farmers around the world as part of a public relations stunt, which is designed to kind of encourage greater sort of public sympathies for genetically modified products. And Okja, this particular pig, is sent to live with a farmer and his granddaughter. The granddaughter and the pig become really close friends, and then the corporation take the pig back, take Okja back, and then it becomes a kind of rescue movie, and it's about rescuing Okja from this corporation.
And it's fair to say, I think, that this is not a film we would have expected to see in the kind of pre-streaming era. It's not one that Hollywood would have made.
No, I think that's one of the things that's widely recognised because of the sorts of messages that the director actually intentionally wanted to convey with this film. And particularly, he wants to critique capitalism and the capitalistic exploitation of animals and their suffering that's caused by capitalism. This is not something that, if we think about this in kind of broader Hollywood terms, this is not something that would be an easy sell to raise funds to make outside of Netflix. And I think this was widely recognised. Actually, it was commented on that the director ended up, being given carte blanche to make the film that he wanted to make, with the themes challenging as they are for a lot of audiences. He was enabled to do that by Netflix. So I think that it's important to recognise again that Netflix as a platform, it certainly we can critique a lot of aspects of Netflix, but as a platform, it absolutely has been crucial in, I think, bringing films to a wider audience. That, first of all, films that wouldn't have been made ordinarily, so a film like Okja, which would never have been made, but certainly other documentaries as well, which have been streamed on Netflix. And you mentioned quite a few just before. There's a range of different films that would never have reached the audiences that they did if it hadn't have been for streaming platforms. So this is part of that environment that I was talking about, that kind of shifting environment that has changed the ways in which films are both funded and distributed, and the way in which audiences can access them. So we see this as, part of that kind of big shift that happens. And we actually point to sort of, Earthlings as a really good example of this early on in the early 2000s, because of course this was a film that made the most of opportunities to be distributed online, to reach a wider audience, and it was feature length, and that was quite unusual at the time. In fact, we saw a really big shift from the early 2000s to now in terms of just audiences generally for documentary. And we can see how that's, ended up with, for example, a huge increase in the number of documentary film festivals, the numbers of documentaries that are available. So audiences are now really interested in documentary again, which, that was not the case, certainly at the end of the 1990s and beginning of the 2000s. So we've seen some big shifts. And I think that animal advocacy messaging has definitely seen some benefits and reached wider audiences as a result of that, in this new kind of environment that we've got.
I appreciate your desire to avoid unnecessary spoilers, but one of the things I really wanted to ask about was the depiction of the Animal Liberation Front in the film, because of course they show up towards the end. And this is a group that's really typically quite demonized in our media, whether that's factual media, whether that's the TV, whether that's newspapers, whatever it might be. They're labeled as, or depicted as, terrorist or a paramilitary organization. But there's really something quite different going on in how they're presented in Okja.
Yes. So it's interesting. So the director actually did a lot of research, and he was very sympathetic towards the Animal Liberation Front, both personally and in terms of the representations that he creates in the film. So in the film, the way that the ALF is presented is very much as a sort of kindly, sometimes a little amateurish, but very well intentioned, and certainly, only interested in the good of animals, and morally, absolutely the audience is encouraged all the way through the film to align themselves kind of morally with the tenets of the Animal Liberation Front. They're certainly not depicted in the ways that we might expect, which we see in other film and television representations, which is that they're, usually depicted as violent, unstable terrorists that are, demonized, within society. In this film, they are absolutely the heroes of the piece. Alongside the granddaughter, they become Okja's rescuers. It's a little complicated because they have a plan, which is both to rescue Okja, but then to return her to the corporation so that they can gather more evidence of the corporation's dreadful mistreatment of the pigs. It's a really interesting dynamic. So alongside the granddaughter, the ALF become the heroes. They are Okja's rescuers, and ultimately, towards the end of the film, the audience is very much encouraged to side with them and identify with them, and to identify with the thing that they're wanting to do, which is to release the animals, which is to stop the exploitation, to stop the suffering, and all the way through the film brings you along with them. And absolutely, it's about identifying with them. And this is why I do think it's important that we look at fiction films, because of what Okja is able to do with these fictionalized representations of the Animal Liberation Front. It's able to present a very different kind of representation, one that people aren't used to seeing, but one that absolutely humanizes the Animal Liberation Front and the people that are involved, the activists that are involved. So it's a very interesting film for that reason. And when the film had its premiere at Cannes, it was interesting because a lot of the journalists from the mainstream media did not want to look as if they were agreeing with this pro-ALF sentiment in the film. So there's some very interesting kind of nimble footwork that they have to sort of tiptoe around things and sort of talk about what's great about the film, because it actually, in terms of its critical reception, it got great critical reception and people were very positive about it. At the same time, they didn't want to be seen to agree with or advocate the position, the ALF position. So it was very interesting to look at the way in which it was received broadly by public and by critics.
I was also quite interested in your discussion in the chapter of whether Okja is a children's film, whether it's a film that's suitable for children, and the ambiguity there. Because, of course, it can be really hard to display the reality of what we do to animals in a children's film. So how do you think the depictions of violence and the treatment of animals in Okja compare to, for example, Babe or Chicken Run, familiar children's films that also have a kind of perhaps quite subtle animal activist message, but one that's certainly still there?
Yeah, it's quite different. I think that they use some similar techniques. So, for example, we can absolutely see that there's the anthropomorphization of the pig Okja. And in fact, one of the things that I note in the chapter is how Okja is almost represented as if she is a dog, and she's depicted rolling and catching things and playing in the ways that you would expect a puppy to play. But at the same time, she's very sensitive towards human needs and protecting the granddaughter and so on. So she's a highly anthropomorphized, in some might say a Disneyfied character, and uses many of the kinds of the sort of techniques that we would be used to in Disney films to make her really appealing, really cute. And at the same time, this is a film that also depicts the realities, some of the realities, certainly of animal slaughter and of animal exploitation within industrial farming, the animal industrial complex. And so I think that when we talk about this as a children's film, what was very interesting to me, so initially Netflix, when it was promoting the film, it did use, and it was criticized for this, it used some of the more anthropomorphic and cute and cuddly clips to promote the film, and people thought it was very much aimed at children or children and young people. And initially it was rated as being a film suitable for children, and that would be very quickly changed, and the promotion changed slightly, so it was very much aimed at adults, but there was there was sort of a question over, is it a kind of Disney-ish movie for adults? And then people actually saw it. And one of the things that I found fascinating was when I looked at the difference between how parents responded to it. This is a very, very small number, actually. So in terms of the numbers, this is a tiny, tiny little study. But looking at a group of parents and how they've responded to the film, 12 or 17 parents, and then about 25, 30 children, and how they'd responded to the film. And parents said across the board, this is not suitable for children. And the children said, wasn't quite 100%, but it was around about 95% of the children said, this is a film that children should see. Parents said things like, your children don't want to watch this because it potentially could make them want to become a vegetarian or stop eating meat, as if this were a dreadful thing. And the children said, finally, we get a film, and yes, it's scary, but the only reason it's scary is because what people really do to animals is scary, and it was actually showing that. And so a lot of children appreciated the fact that they were able to watch a film that showed them realities of what happens within industrial farming, but at the same time they could do it in what you might think more of a safe environment. So they did identify with the granddaughter in the film, and they identify with Okja, and they want Okja to be saved. The scenes in the slaughterhouse are, and there is another scene as well, which is actually it's quite difficult to watch. It's it's very dark, and it is describing the realities of what happens when animals go into a slaughterhouse. And so those kinds of scenes, I think those were the ones that certainly parents were concerned about, that they would upset children. As I say, the children were saying, this is actually what happens, so why are you hiding this from us? And I do think that we often have to credit children with more than we do into their ability to actually understand the world. And yes, I understand why people want to shield people, children especially, from horrible things. But then do we not then have to ask, why are we doing these horrible things in the first place and normalizing them? It's interesting, the differences in the parental response and the children's response. And certainly the children were very encouraging and said, we need more films like this. We need the films that show us the realities of what goes on, because children want to be informed. They actually do want to know. And again, when I say children, this is older children. So this is 9 and above. So we're not talking about very, very small children here. But quite different from Chicken Run and Babe, which, as you say, the messaging is very soft. At the same time, they still do show some of the elements of, for example, slaughter, and certainly, the ways in which the narratives unfold. It is about, animals not dying and saving animals from, what's seen as the kind of the inevitability. But I do think that Okja is definitely darker. There is a difference because, of course, the ways in which the representations are created and the extent to which they are, I'm going to say Disneyfied, because I think people always recognize what that means. In Okja, there's moments where certainly the slaughterhouse imagery is very real. and it feels very real, which is certainly not the case when you think about Chicken Run and Babe. You know, those are films where the aesthetics continue all the way through, so the kind of Disney-fied aesthetic is unrelenting. It's right the way through, and there's nothing there that's especially challenging, and a lot of things are hinted at, whereas in Okja there are aspects which are shown which you wouldn't find in something like Babe and Chicken Run. So actual, you know, sort of animal mistreatment and the realities of it, that's shown in a different way in Okja.
Let me ask you a question that pushes back into work you've been doing for years and years. But do you worry when we talk about the kind of Disneyfication of these animals that this anthropomorphism gives people a kind of escape route, in the sense that they could say, oh, well, I wouldn't eat pigs if they were like Okja or they were like Babe, but real pigs aren't like that. They don't speak. They don't have these cute bodies. They have cute bodies, but different kinds of cute bodies. They behave in different ways.
I'm probably going to shock people here and say that I've actually written a whole book which is advocating for anthropomorphism, whilst recognizing at the same time that there are absolute issues and limitations with anthropomorphism, and that reducing an animal down to a human in a furry coat is not helpful for anybody. At the same time, I think that anthropomorphism is a really helpful tool that can be used to encourage people to see animals as subjective, thinking, feeling beings. So I think that actually there's a place for anthropomorphism in animal advocacy messaging and films, and I'm a great fan of anthropomorphism, done in the right way. I think it has to be done in the right way. And even aspects of Disneyfication. And one of the reasons that I'll say this is because when you talk to people and they talk about their love for animals, a lot of the time they will talk about how Disney films are part of that accrual of, you know, kind of understanding animals as being individuals and as being subjective and as having thoughts and feelings. And so I think we can never fully dismiss the ways in which even commercial filmmaking and those enterprises that might actually be there to exploit animals in the long run, actually the ways in which through that exploitation they create them as subjective beings. And that can actually work in a positive way to encourage the public more broadly to think of animals in that way. So I think you have to take it on a case-by-case basis. I don't think it's something that I can say across the board anthropomorphism is brilliant and let's all celebrate it. No, I'm absolutely not saying that. But I'm saying done right, anthropomorphism is an incredibly powerful tool that asks us to think about how those animals in front of us are actually thinking, feeling beings that deserve to have a life. And I think that's for some people, that's a huge leap to make. And anthropomorphism can be the vehicle that helps them make that leap.
Now, Claire, you're a returning guest, so I have 4 quick questions for you, which are not our usual questions. So my first quick question today is, what's been the most satisfying or rewarding aspect of conducting animal studies research?
The most satisfying or rewarding aspect is being able to spend time doing research and thinking about things that I really care about. And especially when that has some impact, that's even better. And also seeing the field expand over the last 25 years or so, I think has been really thrilling. So definitely there are rewarding and satisfying aspects to it.
And then on the flip side, what's been the most challenging or disheartening aspect of conducting animal studies research?
This goes hand in hand, unfortunately, with the positive side of it. I would say it's the having to stay informed and be informed about the ways in which humans exploit and inflict suffering on other animals, because unfortunately you have to know that stuff to write about do the kind of work that we do. And I think as well, despite saying seeing, we've seen this field grow, and that's really positive, and it's fantastic. It's still very disappointing that despite it being so well developed, the field, I'd say something like critical animal studies remains marginalized, remains kind of peripheral sometimes in terms of the kind of wider academic debates and sort of intellectual trajectories, and so that's disappointing.
This next question is one of my favourites, especially when I'm asking it to someone like you who's been instrumental in shaping parts of our discipline. Can you think of an animal studies scholar that you'd like to make listeners aware of? Someone who might be emerging or might work in a slightly different way to other animal studies scholars, so they've been missed, or someone who doesn't write in English, just someone who you think our listeners should really know about but perhaps don't.
I do, and I hope that they don't take offence by this, because I'm actually saying this because I just think they are amazing. I'm sure you've probably heard of them. Justyna Wodacek from University of Warsaw. I'm such a huge fan of their work, especially their work on dogs, and they do write in English and Polish. And so I would say, Justyna's work I just think is amazing.
I interviewed Justyna about her work on the history of dog training. A really kind of an enormous book, so much detail, so rich.
It's brilliant book. It's a fantastic book.
So my last question, and this is a very hard question, I'm never sure how I'd answer it. Well, I can't remember how I did answer it when I was asked, but are you optimistic about the future of human, non-human animal relationships?
I am. Yes, I am going to say that I'm optimistic, and you might get a different answer from me on a different day, but I'm going to say that I am optimistic, and here's the reason why I feel optimistic. I feel optimistic because I am in a really fortunate position that I am seeing a next generation of scholars coming through. And we have the PhD students in the Centre for Human Animal Studies at Edge Hill University, and we have all our visiting PhD students who are amazing. And you cannot fail to be impressed by the work that they're doing. And so this gives me great hope for the future, both for the field and for human, non-human animal relations sort of in general. So yes, I'm going to say today, I think it's really positive. But if you call me on a different day, I might say something different depending on what I've been reading or thinking about that day. But certainly if I think about our PhD students and that next generation of scholars, wow. We've got some amazing people who are coming through who are going to they are going to change things. I'm convinced of that.
What are you working on next?
After I did the Animal Activism on and Off Screen book, I just recently had another book that came out on animals and landscapes. That was out last month. But I'm currently working on a new book about dogs in myth and media. That one, I hope, I'm working on that probably over the next year or so. So hopefully that will be out around 2027, end of 2027, maybe sometime like that.
And how can people find out more about your work?
Easiest way is to Google me and then go to my institutional webpage at Edge Hill University. And there's lots of detail on there about what I've done and things that I've written. And you can access various things, including there should be links there to the Animal Activism on and Off Screen book and to the last book that we've just done on animals and landscapes, which is free to download.
Well, thanks so much, Claire, for joining us for this episode.
Well, you're very welcome. It's been lovely to speak to you. Thank you.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. You can follow us on X or on Facebook, and you can find me all over social media as well. I'm on X, I'm on Instagram, I'm on Blue Sky, and I'm even on LinkedIn now. My name's Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.